Affairs and a professor of law at the Columbus School of Law. She is, and a professor of law at Catholic University of America. Professor Leary is a former federal prosecutor, and she examines the intersection of criminal law, criminal procedure, technology, and contemporary victimization. She's focused on the exploitation of abusive women, children, and marginalized people. She's a recognized expert in the areas of criminal law and procedure, victimization, exploitation, human trafficking, missing persons, technology, and the Fourth Amendment. She is the lead co-author of Perspectives on Persons Cases, which is the only comprehensive multidisciplinary book of this type of victimization. And she's also published several articles in this space as well. Professor Leary is well recognized as a leader in this area of human trafficking, particularly labor trafficking, and we're delighted to have her here. We are going to start with Professor Leary giving us some information about what labor trafficking is and some of the trends that she has been seeing. We will then go into a Q&A period. If you do have a question for Professor Leary, please put it in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, Professor Leary, thank you so much and welcome.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. And the slides will come up in a second. I am honored to be here. I thank the Anti-Trafficking International for all the work they're doing in this space. And labor trafficking, look, it does not get a lot of attention. So it's really important when we can all come together. And I want to thank all of you giving up your evening to learn about this topic or share your experiences. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start with, we can go to the first slide, is some definitions. What are we talking about with labor trafficking or forced labor? And with forced labor, we have a number of sources. So here's one from the International Labor Organization. That's the UN agency that aims to promote decent work in the world. And this is how they have defined it almost 100 years ago. Work or service which is exacted from a person under menace or any penalty for which that person hasn't offered himself voluntarily. So that's one definition. It excludes a few things, and the next slide lists what it excludes. So obviously there are times when people are forced to do certain things, drafted into the military as a result of a criminal conviction. There are limits to that. Emergency situations come up. So the international definition has excluded from forced labor those types of things. But if we go to the next slide, we can see another international definition, and this comes from the Palermo Protocol. Those of you who've been to these sessions before have probably heard reference to this. And the year 2000 was a big year for trafficking in the world and in the country. In the world, the Palermo Protocol was finished and countries started signing it. Its long title is the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. It focused on sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And in the labor trafficking component, this is what the elements are of labor trafficking. And you've probably seen this framing before. Action means purpose. A lot of the anti-trafficking movement has this as a way to sort of understand these complex legal definitions. But essentially, if you recruit someone or you transport them or you transfer, harbor, or you accept them, that's the action, any of those things, and you do that through force, fraud, deception, and look at this broad definition, abuse of power or position of vulnerability, as well as paying someone else. So that's how you do it, what you do, action, how you do it means, and the purpose for forced labor under international law, that would be labor trafficking. If you go to the next slide, please. And then in the United States, the year 2000 was a really big year as well, because we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But of course, we all know that forced labor has existed for centuries in civilization. So before the year 2000, and that's why I have written here predating TVPA, we have United States statutes. These are the statutes that were passed after the Constitution was amended, involved regarding slavery. So these are sort of old titles, but they're still good law. And in section 1581, peonage, I've defined that for you. That's involuntary servitude that's tied to a payment of a debt. So sometimes people are forced into labor that way, or slavery, or 1584, involuntary servitude. So you might think, well, aren't those statutes enough? Why did we have to have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act? Well, the next slide will tell us that story. This is, well, I should say the next slide is the elements of involuntary servitude. So if you knowingly or willfully, so you have to not do it by accident, hold someone in involuntary servitude or sell someone for any period of time or bring someone to the United States for that purpose, that is going to be involuntary servitude. The next slide will tell us our story. So you'd think that would be enough. However, in 1988, a case went before the Supreme Court, United States versus Kozminski. And in this case, the facts were pretty terrible. Two men were discovered by law enforcement after somebody finally reported them working on the Kozminski's farm. One gentleman had an IQ of 67. He had lived most of his life in institutional settings or working on farms, and he had been brought to that farm in 1967. Another gentleman had an IQ that was even lower. He was unemployed and living on the streets when Mrs. Kozminski picked him up one day and just brought him to her farm, and that was in 1972. And they were both brought there to work on this farm. And they worked on this farm 7 days a week, 17 hours a day. They never got paid. The newspaper coverage says once they got paid $10 on a holiday. The court records say it started off at $15 a day, but then it just ended. And during the time they were there, they were physically abused. They were, the staff was told to discipline them if they wanted, and they lived in absolutely deplorable living conditions. A trailer, no heat, and this is Michigan, no running water. And they were threatened various ways. One most powerful way was say, well, we're going to return you to a mental institution where at least one of these gentlemen had lived in it. They were totally dependent on the Kozminskis for everything, and they were isolated from everyone else. So you'd think that would be slavery, right? The government prosecuted them and argued that they were guilty under 1584. We can go 2 more slides if you would, please. But the Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court, 9-0, 9 justices to 0, said that's not slavery. This statute, this 1584 statute, that's a 13th Amendment statute. Involuntary servitude requires physical force, is essentially what this quote is saying. Physical force. That's what Congress had in mind when they passed the statute, what we traditionally think of as slavery, force or threat of force. Now, the government did argue that there was some physical abuse in this context, but the jury instructions went back and listed everything, physical force, the psychological force, all of those things. And the court said, that's not okay. In fact, the question before the court was, does this statute extend to the use of psychological coercion? And the court said no. So if we go to the next slide. So part of the impetus for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was to respond to that. And in the findings of the act, Congress points out that we have forced labor today. It's just not necessarily with chains. It is often used with other kinds of coercion. So this is a new statute, 1589, forced labor. And you see the elements there, still have to do it knowingly. And we'll go through the action, means, purpose in a second. But it talks about force, threats of force, physical restraint. But then note where it says serious harm, by means of serious harm or threats of serious harm, or by means of abuse or threaten abuse of the law, like you're not here legally, I'm going to report you. You have a warrant out for you. If you don't work, I'm going to report you. Those sorts of things. Or even if somebody enters into a pattern that is trying to cause a person to believe if they don't do the work, then they will suffer serious harm or physical restraint. So that's the legal stuff. But if we take the next slide here, you can see that Congress defined these things more. They say, well, what's coercion? Coercion is those things at the end of the statute, threatening someone with serious harm, okay, or abusing the legal process. But the next slide is really important. Congress told us what serious harm is, and it's any harm. So here's where they expanded beyond the physical. Not just physical, but non-physical, psychological, financial, reputational. But you can imagine a circumstance, where somebody says, hey, I'm going to cut your pay if you don't work. That's probably not enough. It's got to be that's sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person, this is what's important, of the same background or the same circumstance to do that work, or to feel like they have to do that work in order to avoid the harm. That's really important because Congress recognized it's not just physical force, but it's all these other things. And they also recognize the reality of forced labor, of labor trafficking, is taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities. So like in the Kozminski case, this test would allow the threat, I'm going to send you back to the psychiatric institution. Well, that might not make me, someone who has never been to a psychiatric institution, that might not compel me. But if I've been to one and I know that they picked me up from being homeless, that might, because that background under those circumstances, that might compel me to continue working. So Congress did that. And so if we go to the next slide, under US law, this additional statute, the action is the same thing, recruitment, harboring, etc., but it's force, fraud, or coercion, and we've talked about what coercion is, to involuntary servitude, the old statute, or these other things as well. If we can go to one slide. If those of you who feel like this is too much law school, I think there's a great definition that Bill Wolf, who runs here, ATI, what he talks about, he just says, look, it's compelling a person to engage in forced labor. A simple definition, a plain English definition, okay? But a couple of things that are important that I want to point out. If we go to the next slide real quick. Those of you who are familiar with trafficking, a lot of times we talk about this force, fraud, or coercion. But in sex trafficking, we then usually say, unless the victim is less than 18, you don't need force, fraud, or coercion in sex trafficking. But labor trafficking is different. There is no distinction between a child being forced to work and an adult being forced to work. Now, of course, that level of force or coercion is different because of our definition of serious harm. But it's important for you to understand you still have to show force, fraud, or coercion under American law in order to proceed with this labor trafficking statute. So that's our definitions: international, domestic, plain English. Now let's talk a little bit about how big this problem is. If we could go to the next slide. Now the first thing I want to do is warn you, okay? No numbers adequately count how broad labor trafficking is. They just don't. And it's very hard to identify. Why? Lots of reasons. Here's a few. We're dealing with marginalized victims a lot of the time, vulnerable people, etc. But this is a crime distinct often from sex trafficking in that it's referred to as being hidden in plain sight. And what I mean by that is, with sex trafficking, often you can see some behaviors that are illegal or that suggest illegality, because in most of the United States, prostitution is illegal. So when an officer or a citizen see something that looks like it might be prostitution, or see something that looks suspicious in that realm, perhaps one person with a number of minor girls dressed a certain way in the back of their car. Maybe they see an ad online or have an interaction online that suggests something like that. That will set off some warnings. In labor trafficking or forced labor, you see from the side of the road somebody working in a field, there's nothing suspicious about that. You go to a hair salon, which is a business that frequently is a source of forced labor. There's nothing that will jump out at you with regard to that. Domestic service, as we'll talk about, is a major area of forced labor in the United States. Again, lots of people have domestic service. So it's hidden in plain sight. Additionally, unlike sex trafficking, which often has to have a public face, right? Because ultimately the person trafficked has to interact with the purchaser. Labor trafficking often happens in isolation, and it's often connected to legitimate work, something that seems legitimate or legal. Let's go to the next slide. Given those caveats, how big is it? Well, really big. The International Labor Organization estimates, look at that, 40.3 million people are in what they call modern slavery, and definitions matter here. They say 25 million are forced labor, okay? But keep in mind how they define these things. It really sort of doesn't matter. The statement that many of us have heard over and over again is still true. There's more people enslaved today in the world than there were back in the 19th century, okay? ILO estimates 16 million people are exploited in the private sector, okay? And we know that this is a very gendered space, not as gendered as sex trafficking for sure, which very much disproportionately affects women and girls, but even in labor trafficking, according to the ILO, those estimates are still a majority of women and girls. If we go to the next slide, again, how big is this? Human Rights First, using ILO numbers, estimates we are talking human trafficking in general, $150 billion. But if we subtract the sex trafficking out of it, we're still talking over $50 billion in profits, or also money saved. You could put it that way. Construction, mining, manufacturing, those are the big areas internationally. Go to the next slide. Where do we see trafficking a lot? Again, we have to take it all with a caveat, but this is from the Department of Labor. Every year, the Department of Labor issues a report where it tries to highlight the goods that they believe are coming from forced labor and child labor. It's about a 110-page report, so this is just a snapshot to give you a sense of things. But look at the child labor. Many of these are products that we use every day. Same thing with forced labor. The former ambassador for trafficking here in the United States, Lou DeBacca, was here at the university giving a lecture, and he said something that always stuck with me. He said, you should assume if you eat a piece of chocolate, a child's hands were on that at some point. That's the breadth of child labor in the cocoa industry. Of course, we also see this with regard to lots of other products that we use. Many of you have been familiar with a lot of the exposés in recent years regarding the fishing industry and the shrimp industry and where trafficking is there. So this list changes very much from year to year, but it's there, and some of these items are always on it. If we can go to the next slide. In the United States, what's the most common form? Well, this is one measure. And again, we don't have great measures, but there is a hotline, a trafficking hotline, and they report that these are the things that people are most commonly calling to report. So that doesn't mean they're the most common forms of labor trafficking, but domestic work, as I said, a pretty big area. Agriculture, construction, illicit work, and that means when you force someone to engage in illegal work. Or there's child begging is a large problem in some countries. And in the United States, it's a problem as well. And then traveling sales of all things, that still comes up again and again. So that's a snapshot of how big the problem is and things that we see in the United States. what causes this? And if we go to the next chapter, give you what's referred to as the push-pull factors. What pushes people into trafficking? What pulls people into trafficking? And here are some common things. Mass displacement. We see trafficking spike in situations where there's a major disaster. So you might remember the earthquake in Haiti, the typhoon in Thailand, now war in Ukraine. All of those things which causes mass displacement. Unfortunately, what we hear is we see traffickers coming in and taking advantage of that, desperate people. So these push factors, poverty, of course, lack of access to education, lack of access to employment, violence, all those types of things that might make somebody susceptible to a fraudulent or coercive working arrangement. But what are the pull factors? Well, there's demand for cheap goods. And I'd like you to think about demand. There's consumer demand, right? For fast fashion, for coffee, for chocolate, for batteries. And then there's also corporate demand, right? Not wanting to spend too much to produce their products. The pull factors, of course, are hope. Many people who are victimized by forced labor or labor trafficking are defrauded. They're told, come take this job here, this is what you'll be doing, or we'll send you to school, or here's how much you'll get paid, only to arrive, and that's not the case. Security, looking for security, stability, access to education, employment, or they're fleeing persecution. And on that security piece, I'll give you a great example. One of the victims in the Kozminski case, he was very, very worried, one of the witnesses testified, when the owners left the farm, that he wasn't going to get fed because he was so dependent upon them for his food that even though it was horrible conditions, okay, he at least it provided him from his perspective some security. If we go to the next slide. So, given the scope of this and the causes of this, I would think that you might expect there's a lot of investigation and prosecution. But if we could go to the next slide, we'll see that's not really the case. So these numbers are from the Trafficking in Persons report. Many of you are familiar with that. That is an annual report from the State Department, which rates every country's anti-trafficking efforts. And they rate them on prosecutions and investigations is one of the criteria. And according to that report for fiscal year 2020, there were 660 investigations of human trafficking. 41 of them involved labor trafficking, and that's 6%. They counted 210 prosecutions, 7% labor trafficking. Now, the Department of Defense is also part of this report, and noticeably, look what they're doing. They actually are doing a lot of forced labor investigations and those sorts of cases. Why? Probably because of the subcontractors who are hired out to work and do support for different military ventures. They have a problem with recruiters sometimes. So they have subcontractors who recruit laborers to come and do certain things, and it's the subcontractors who could be problematic. If we could go to the next slide. That's not the only measure, though. The Human Trafficking Institute is a nonprofit right here in Northern Virginia, and they issue an annual federal human trafficking report where they go through every published opinion. They go through public court records. They go through press releases to try to measure and analyze what are the federal cases, so not the state cases. And they found 579 active human trafficking prosecutions in 2020. 6% of them were labor trafficking. But what's interesting is our Trafficking Victims Protection Act also has something that's called a private right of action. So Congress allows victim survivors to sue their traffickers in addition to a criminal prosecution. And there we see a majority of active civil lawsuits are forced labor. So in that sector, we're actually seeing attorneys, usually pro bono attorneys, taking up the cases of these folks, trying to sue their traffickers to get back wages and those sorts of things. If we go to the next slide. So why so few? Well, I talked about this in the beginning. They're hard cases to identify. And a lot of the victim survivors, as many of you know who've worked in all different capacities in trafficking, they don't self-identify as victims. Again, these victims are vulnerable. And there's a gray area, right, between bad working conditions. That doesn't necessarily mean it's forced labor, right? There's a gray area between violation of wage and hour laws, which is illegal, and labor trafficking. So victim survivors also might have vulnerabilities. They might be from a different culture. We talked about peonage in the beginning of my talk. In some cultures, that is a norm, that you inherit the debts of your parents. So when you're told, hey, you have to work off your debt because you're living in the business housing, and even though you're getting paid, sure, but we're deducting your living, and so that actually means you owe us money. For some cultures, that doesn't sound as odd as it might to someone who's from a different culture. Isolation, as I said, is a big thing. Physical isolation, right? So keeping people isolated from their family, friends, support network. If a victim survivor is perhaps not from the United States, if we're talking domestically, then they don't have their support network. Geographical isolation. In many construction situations, or in agriculture situations, or in domestic servitude, the folks are not interacting with other people. Language, again, we hear from labor trafficking folks who have been trafficked and they're from other countries. Sometimes they don't know where they are in the country and they don't speak the language. So the difficulty in even knowing where to go. There's a level of shame. Some traffickers, some trafficking victims talk about that, feeling like they shouldn't have been duped like this. There must be a way out, that sort of thing. And this idea of absolute control is really important. Again, domestic servitude is a great example. That person is reliant on their employer, sometimes for their immigration status, for their shelter, their food, where they sleep, etc. And that can be true in other forced laboring contexts where people all sleep together, they have housing. So every aspect of your life is controlled by the employer. Corruption is also a big factor. There are many cases in areas where people kind of know what's going on and they all look the other way. Then the questions about political will. Political will to prosecute these cases, to investigate these cases, might involve, often does involve, addressing a business, company, farm, family in your community. And that can be challenging. We go to the next slide. So what are some signs of trafficking? Well, there's a lot, but as I said, it's very hard to notice. But the Department of State has listed these as indicators. None of them for sure say that this is trafficking, of course, but they're indicators. Living with the employer, poor living conditions, multiple people in a cramped space. We see that a lot with the cleaning crews. And those types where you've got multiple people living in, one room apartment, etc. The inability to reach people, to speak alone. This is a big one for victim survivors who are immigrants. Often the employers will hold on to their identity and their documents, so they feel as though they cannot leave. And then you see other things. It's important to note it says unpaid or paid very little. You don't have to not pay someone. And oftentimes there'll be a little bit of pay in order to try to suggest that this isn't forced labor. But it is never really, an inadequate amount is enough. So if you go to the next slide. So what are we seeing now as we talk about forced labor? Well, many of you have noticed this in the mainstream media, right? There's a lot more talk about supply chains, right? Supply chains, big college degree, supply chain management, etc. Well, a little bit of history here. So in supply chains, our initial foray into looking at that seriously from a labor trafficking perspective actually started in the state of California. About a decade ago, California passed the Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Now, it's just one state, you say. Does it really matter? Well, California today has the 5th largest economy in the world. Okay, it is larger than Germany and Great Britain. It is a giant economy. So when they do things, they matter. But they use this transparency model, and all it did is it required companies of a certain size to conspicuously post on their website the efforts that they were taking to determine that their supply chains were free of forced labor. Now, those of you who heard that are thinking, well, that doesn't sound like much, and arguably it's not, right? Because you could have, as a company, put on your website, we aren't doing anything to verify. We aren't doing anything to audit our supply chains. It just wanted you to at least start sharing that information. And the theory behind this was twofold. One was consumer education. That was what they thought. They said that consumers will care if a company is doing things or not. And then also a little bit of shame, right? If you are a company, are you actually going to put on your website that you're not doing anything? Maybe it will prompt you to do some things. So it was an interesting first step. There's not a lot of teeth to this act. There's no criminal sanctions or those sorts of things. Another model of this we see in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act, also a transparency model where it requires companies in Australia. It's a little bit more detailed, a little bit more structured, but that same idea that you have to file this report. But the exciting news is we're seeing a shift from this transparency model to what's been referred to as a diligence model. And this really started off with Germany, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And this is obviously a very new act, as you can see. But what Germany is doing is saying, we don't care about transparency. We care a little bit more about accountability. So it's requiring companies of a certain size, and it goes into full effect in 2023, and then it affects more companies the following year. But they have to do things like develop a risk management plan, identify and define people who are responsible for compliance with that plan, execute an assessment, have a remedial plan, have a system for internal complaints, address the supply chain of not only their direct suppliers, but their indirect suppliers. So they're really requiring companies to actually do the work and certify that their supply chain is free of forced labor. And that's such a big deal. The EU itself has issued a directive saying they're expecting to do the same as well. And this directive has put people on notice, and they're now working on the proposal right now. So that's very exciting to see us move from transparency to diligence. In the United States, we've seen some movement as well. This is a little bit wonky law professory, but a little bit of tariff law, not my area of expertise. But for many years, we have forbidden the importation of products made by forced labor. It's a little bit more detailed than that, but that's been true for a long time. However, for many years, we also had this thing called the consumptive demand exception, which essentially said, and I'm not doing it justice, we don't want products made by forced labor unless we really need them and we don't make them here. Now, that's kind of an exception that swallows the rule. Well, a few years ago, Congress got rid of it. They got rid of it, which is a pretty big deal. And what that's allowed us to do on the border is issue some orders to preclude things coming in the country. And very recently, Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which actually singles out this region in China where we know that Uyghurs are being forced into labor, and products from that are presumed to be the product of forced labor. And if an entity wants to import those products, the burden is on them to establish they're not the product of forced labor. Brand new law. We'll see how it works, but it is a move to be a little bit more aggressive in the United States. And this was that rare thing we don't see often. bipartisan legislation to do this, in part for the human rights aspect of it. So that's sort of some exciting trends that are going on now. And my last two slides, if we could, or my last slide, if we could go one more, is what are we to do as ordinary people? Well, there's a big move for consumers to take a more active role. And these are just some resources for you to think about. Slaveryfootprint.org is an opportunity for you to answer some questions about your lifestyle. And it's asking you the question, how many slaves do you think work for you? You know, it's not a perfect measure, but it's helpful to bring home how we as consumers are part of the pull factors, part of the demand. We also, these are a couple other resources. The Department of Labor has a tool, and there's many other ones. This is just an example of ways that a consumer can be more educated. And really, what are we to do? I'd offer you my own insight. I've studied social movements and how they relate to the criminal law for a number of years now. And my observation has been this. There's essentially three components to a successful social movement. First, the law. The law needs to change. Now, sometimes the law leads, right? And society catches up. I would say that's true in human trafficking. Sometimes society moves and the law catches up. But there usually has to be a change in the law. But I think often essential to that is education. Education for people about the social harm, the harm of, in this case, forced labor, to not make it abstract, but real. And then, frankly, stigma, social stigma. People have to care. A company has to be embarrassed if there's forced labor in their supply chain, for example. And that's where we all can play a part, as to say, I'm not going to purchase these items, or I'm going to support this law that will not allow this to happen. So that's my comments on what we're seeing today. The law has changed in the last 2 decades, what forced labor is, how big it is, and what we can do, hopefully, to play a part to stop it. And welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Leary. That was a really interesting overview of the issue and making us quasi-law students here as we get familiar with some of these terms. So really appreciate that and your ability to put it in plain English. I'll also say the slaveryfootprint.org tool that you point to is one that I have used, and it's quite sobering. So for those of you who are interested in that, highly, highly recommend those resources that Professor Leary pointed to. We do have some questions coming in, so we'll start to go through those. First, just some housekeeping. An attendee asked whether the webinar will be available to share. ATI does record these webinars, and we will offer them on our YouTube site. So if you have registered for this event, you will get an email that lets you know where that is, as well as a link to a survey to let us know what you think of our event. So please do keep a lookout. But for the substance of our presentation, Professor Leary, we got a question about if labor trafficking is the bigger problem, are the prosecution guidelines too strict? And is their strict nature a contributing factor to our inability to bring forward prosecutions here? What do you think about that?
That's a great question. And I don't know if by prosecution guidelines, they mean sort of the internal guidelines of either the Department of Justice, if we're talking federally. And I should have mentioned every state has anti-trafficking law on the state level as well. And I certainly don't think federally, I can speak to the U.S. Attorney's Manual, I don't think those guidelines are too high, sort of what's written in paper. I think the reality is, and I wouldn't say it's a bigger problem than sex trafficking, it's a bigger problem than we realize. And I think my opinion would be it's limited resources, right? If you are a prosecutor and you have a case where it's low wages, but the person was free to come and go, but that's a very intensive, all trafficking cases are very time and resource intensive. And I think they can be challenging to do. So I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is, and I'm not making light of this, to win a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a very high burden. And so I think that for prosecutors in weighing these things, those are much more challenging cases. But to your point, one of the things that my good friend John Cotton Richmond, who is our most recent ambassador for trafficking, and he was a federal prosecutor, he and I sat on panels together, and we'd say, we have to approach these cases like we do homicides. We build the cases. We bring in experts. We get the witnesses who can say, I saw this threat happen, or look at how much weight they've lost. You build the cases. Just the question is, do we have enough resources to do it? Long-winded answer, I apologize, but it's very complicated.
Do you think that given the trend and what you've seen in the new laws that have been introduced, especially in the United States, that we're going to see more resources dedicated to prosecuting those cases?
My opinion, I'm not really sure. I think it is getting more on the radar, but I think honestly, in the offices that are prosecuting trafficking, sex trafficking is so much more obvious. And as we know, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, it's real time. It's children often. I think that there's just so much trafficking. I'm not sure if we'll see an increase in prosecutions. We might, but I think that let me correct that. The Department of Justice did recently expand their human trafficking unit pretty significantly. So I think there's hope that we can. But trafficking writ large is such a big problem, and the resources are so tight. It's really difficult for our prosecutors, and I speak as a former prosecutor, to choose what cases are we going forward on, because we can't go forward on them all.
As you think about the United States and trafficking that happens inside of our borders, we're starting to get some questions from our audience about, state by state, what labor trafficking looks like. Can you give us a sense whether in your research, in your observations, does labor trafficking look different, say from the breadbasket to New York, to Washington, D.C., to Texas? Do you notice different trends regionally or state by state?
I do, and that's such a great question. I like to say that, I don't like to say it, but an observation I made is trafficking is both global and local. And by that, I mean, we see trafficking obviously throughout the world. It does not honor geopolitical borders, but what it looks like does vary from place to place. So for example, California, Florida, that's a lot of agriculture, trafficking, etc. In some of our more urban centers, we'll see different kinds of trafficking. As I mentioned, nail salons, hair salons, those are big places. When there's been a disaster like in Katrina, there were a lot of cases involving labor trafficking in the construction area after that. So it does vary a lot. And that's why it's really important for law enforcement, prosecutors to really get a sense of what's happening on the ground, to forge those relationships with the NGOs, et cetera, with the unions, with the folks who maybe work with immigrants, if that's a part of your trafficking, and that's not true everywhere, to get a sense of where are the risk factors in our communities.
Do you think there's a role for universities to study the issues state by state to start to get better data and insights into what's happening at a state level?
I absolutely do. Here at the Catholic University of America, we are trying to do that with a project that we've announced and are trying to get off the ground called the Bakita Project, where we're trying to look at labor trafficking as it manifests in certain sectors. And our hope is that we'll be able to share that model throughout the country and the world. And that's exactly the hope, that universities in their own jurisdictions, familiar with the issues in their space, can study it in their space. And lots of universities throughout the United States are doing this work. University of Arizona has done a lot of work. Some of the Colorado universities have looked in this space very much. So I do think that this is a place where academics can be more pracademics and not in our ivory tower speculating, but really using their skill set to see what's happening on the ground and what are the laws, what are the regulations, what are the social services, all of those things that need to be in place to disrupt it.
That's really helpful. Thank you. If you're someone, just a consumer, and you go to a nail salon, for example, and you suspect perhaps that people there may be a victim of labor trafficking, what should you do? You know, for sex trafficking, we know there are various hotlines that have been made available. Is there something similar on the labor trafficking side?
There is. Well, the trafficking hotline, the U.S. trafficking hotline, applies to both labor and sex trafficking. So that's an obvious, I don't want to say obvious, that's a resource. And often they can connect you. I would say, obviously, call law enforcement. But to be honest, God bless law enforcement. But you never know who you're going to get. So I always recommend to people to ask for the trafficking unit, to make sure you're getting someone, if you can, or ask if there is a trafficking unit. If there isn't, maybe call the hotline and explain that to them. Maybe call the FBI, someone who's familiar with this concept of labor trafficking, to make sure that when they hear you verbalize the risk factors you're seeing, that if they've got some knowledge of this, say, yeah, oh, that's a lot going on. Okay, we'll go check that out.
Okay. As you mentioned, it can be very hard to identify labor trafficking because, you know, as a consumer, we're pretty removed usually from, you know, the back of the house or the operations. But let's take the example of like a hair salon or a nail salon and apply some of the principles that you talked about, signs of labor trafficking. What might we see as we're sitting in the chair there that could raise enough concerns that you would recommend, you know what, that's worth a call to a trafficking unit?
That's a great question. Well, you know, I'd really look at those factors the State Department talked about. So certainly demeanor matters, right? You know, look, and there's a lot of really bad bosses, right? Again, this is really difficult. Demeanor, isolation, physical appearance. So not just demeanor, fear, but, you know, emaciated, tired, etc. Other signs of isolation: can they not speak the language that you have? If when you've been there over time, have you seen them always working? When you've had a 8 a.m. appointment, a 7 p.m. Appointment, those sorts of things. And you know, I'm not sure as a customer if even that would be enough, right, to know. But I think also if ever you hear, and of course, anything physical, and that's not required, or anything psychological, there is many of these cases when we read them, we hear about the real demeaning, right, treatment by employers. And that's all part of the control, right? But you think, gosh, there were other people in the restaurant when I'm reading this court opinion and I find out the person was dressed down and, you know, forced to get on their knees. I'm like, what did everybody else think? So whenever you see, I think, that kind of demeaning control, that's a real signal. But when you've got people who say things like, I don't have my documents, or that sort of thing, that's a real red flag, that is going on. And any kind of isolation. So often these folks don't want the customers to talk to the staff, right? There's fear if you speak to one of those folks. Any of those things, if you see enough of them, it's worth a phone call.
That's really great advice. Thank you. Knowing the statistics is a really helpful way to get transparency and understand what the issues are. You mentioned some resources on the global trafficking statistics. What are your most trusted resources for labor trafficking statistics, both globally and the US? Is there sort of a clearinghouse that you would suggest, or sources that you just have bookmarked that you always go to?
So internationally, I gave you everyone cites to the ILO, really. Everyone cites to that. I think that's considered the most accurate. And there are others. There are lots of others. I mean, I pulled from a few different sources because, as I said, none of these numbers are perfect. So I like to look at multiple sources to see trends and indications, right? So there's the Walk Free Foundation is another global institution that tries to measure these things. different aspects of the UN might cover different aspects of trafficking. And different sectors, the ILO, the UN, will issue independent reports. So I think all of those are really useful, but you gotta look at them all. Domestically, I have to say, our measurements are hard because our measurements are hotline calls, arrests, and prosecutions. And even the Human Trafficking Institute's annual report goes, and this year's report is the 20th anniversary of the TVPA. So they go and look at 20-year trends too. So that's a great resource. And you can just find that if you Google Human Trafficking Institute Federal Report 2020. It's been very good, especially the 20-year look back. But they go out of their way right at the beginning to say this is a measure of prosecutions. That's not a measure of what's happening. And unfortunately, I don't think we have great national measures. I think some jurisdictions might have a better sense what's going on locally, but it's really hard.
And do you think just general awareness of the labor trafficking issue is a big part of the problem? Do you think if we would spread awareness and education that we might start to get some of these better stats and data?
Oh, I sure do, right? I sure do, and I think we're essentially behind where we were with sex trafficking, right? I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't even have 22 years ago, we didn't even have a word trafficking. We were still talking about prostitution, right, as a vice crime. And look where we've come in 20 years. In many ways, we've advanced where we now would no longer say juvenile prostitute, right? We'd say victim of trafficking, et cetera. And I think we're further behind in labor trafficking for all the reasons that I've mentioned. But I do think people are becoming more and more aware. Again, the fishing industry is a great example. I don't think 10 years ago people had any idea what a significant problem that is. But frankly, the New York Times did a huge expose. The United States Catholic Conference of Bishops has been studying this issue for a long time, and people are much more aware of what is happening there. So a lot of it's getting the mainstream media to see the problem and to keep it in the forefront of our minds. For example, with the war in Ukraine, I think we've all seen a few more news stories about this issue given the disruption there. I'm not sure who would have seen that 20 years ago.
That's a good point. So all of you listening to this webinar, send letters to the editor of your favorite news outlet. They do read them. Professor Leary, you talked about businesses getting engaged in this fight against labor trafficking and, you know, how it's really becoming part of their supply chain. For a business that might be kind of new or trying to get their arms around this problem, how do you think that they should start thinking about just understanding labor trafficking and really starting to get rid of it within their own supply chain?
I think that's great, and not to brag about the Catholic University of America, but in legal education, for example, compliance is a really growing area for exactly this. Clients need counsel on how do I comply with all these regulations, but this one is a growing one, and we're seeing many law firms developing compliance and human rights practices. And if you were to Google this German supply chain law, you'll see numerous law firms with their blogs out letting potential clients know, hey, here's what is happening. We can help you comply with this. So to a new startup, I would say the first, depending upon the industry, right? And that really would matter, right? I would say be very conscious of first your local laws. What does your state trafficking law look like? And if you go to the human trafficking hotline at Polaris Project, they've got an interactive web page where you can hover over your state and it'll highlight the laws for you, so you'll know exactly what they are. So that would be the first place I would start, presuming a startup would be small. And then depending upon the scope of your work, understanding the scope of the law. So if you go federally, if you're in California, that's going to be different than if you're in some other states. But I would say if you're starting, yes, it's daunting to try to do that, but if you start small, it's easier to build out. I think what a lot of companies are now having trouble with is they're going in now, very long supply chains. And I think that where supply chains are going is going to be a question too, in light of all the things that have happened in the world, right, in the last few years. Realizing, gosh, these long supply chains create a whole lot of problems. One of them is not being able to keep track of your supply chain. And if I could just complete that thought, I realize it's a long-winded answer, but one of the things that we are seeing again and again in the German law, the European Union's guidance, is almost requiring or strongly recommending independent audits. So not just you sending your folks in or counting on your subcontractors to check on their subcontractors, but hiring independent auditors and have unannounced audits as a norm. That seems to be emerging as a best practice. And it's kind of obvious, but it's also now becoming the norm. I think they're trying to make it the norm, and that will make a big difference.
Yeah, that's really great insight. As consumers, you gave us some tools that we can look at of how we can start to educate ourselves on our slavery footprint and some other things. Are there very quick ways, and I hate to ask for the shortcut in an issue like this, but is there an easy way for a consumer to know that, yes, this product is something that, has a pretty decent supply chain? Is it really just a matter of buying local, or, are there lists to look at? Are there labels to look at? How do you think about that as a consumer?
It's a great question. And of course, I state the obvious, this is a challenge, and it's a luxury for some of us to even be able to think about it, right? As we all know. So it's really complicated, I think. So I think starting with the Labor Department's list, when we understand that, as I think about it today, I'm looking at an empty cup of coffee on my desk. I've got an iPhone with a battery in it. I am wearing cotton. I probably had chocolate today, but I gave it up for Lent, so I'm probably okay there. But when we realize it's really hard to avoid. So being aware, at least if I know there's that list, I can start peeling back on some of those products. There's also often analyses from NGOs about, especially in the world of fashion, what companies are getting a D grade, what companies are getting an A grade. So that's helpful. There's a number of apps that are out there. And again, I think in this space, it's imperfect, but you can look for trends, right? And I think, in my own opinion, we have to assume that, as they say, there is no free lunch. There's a reason why certain products are less expensive. There's a reason why fair trade costs more than not. Now, that's not my area of expertise. And there's a lot of debate about if fair trade is accurate or not. There is some movement to try to get some certifications there, and we'll see where that goes. But as a consumer, I struggle with it, like everyone, I think, struggles with it. But that's, I think, where we have to be right now. Are we struggling with it? And then are we trying to make those choices? And buying local, I think, is a really great idea. And just paying attention to these ratings of the different companies.
It's sort of exciting in some ways to be at the front end of a movement, although it's kind of frustrating that it's taken this long for labor trafficking to come to so much attention. But it really does sound like we are in the early days, and that, we do have the power to continue to promote this conversation. As you look at the younger generations, do you have, additional hope? Are the younger generations a little bit more aware of this issue? Are they willing to activate on this issue? What do you think about that?
Well, we all have to hide this video from my younger generation children if I answer this. But my observations are, I certainly think, as I teach a human trafficking seminar, so my non-scientific study of this generation over the years, I certainly think there's increased awareness of this as an issue, to be sure. I'm not sure. I think it can be, the discussions I have with my students is that feeling, though, it can be overwhelming, right? The feeling it's overwhelming, or the feeling that I'm just one person. And so when we have that dialogue in class, one of the things I try to point out to them is I wrote a paper once about antebellum slavery, and what were the main arguments that people were making who were what I call slavery apologists, right? So they were benefiting from slavery. So basically the northern part of the country, right? If not the ones actually engaged. And they weren't calling for abolition. What were those arguments? And they essentially were threefold. One is, well, the economy will fall apart, right? Two is, it's not really that bad, right? There was that sort of argument, this sort of paternalistic argument. Or three is, well, if not us, it will be someone worse. That was my observation. And so I think that I say to my students when we have these discussions, we all have to be careful not to be making those arguments, right? Like, well, if I don't buy it, then there's still that $3 a day they're getting is still more than they would otherwise, right? That's no different than that argument before. Oh, the economy will fall apart if everything's more expensive. I'm not sure that it will. Or, oh, it will go underground more. So that's a reason to support it. So I think that that as we engage on these issues, young people are more aware, and we have to be conscious of our role in history.
That actually leads me to my next question. And this may be one of the last questions that we ask, but I do encourage people to continue to put their great questions into the chat. You talked about where we are and what the recent trends are. Where do you think we're going to be in 20 years in the labor trafficking issue?
Well, so not shockingly, a former prosecutor who now researches trafficking is probably not Susie Sunshine when she thinks about where we're headed and where we're going. But I think a couple of things. I think where we are right now is what I call trafficking 2.0. So we've got 20 years down, right, in the United States, 20 years of TVPA, Palermo Protocol, 20 years. In many ways, our awareness has really shifted. And in many ways, we have laws that we didn't have. So that every state has a trafficking law now. It wasn't true for many years, but it is true. The country has the TVPA, which has been reauthorized 5 times with tweaks and changes to it. Awareness is up. That's great. But in some ways, you could argue that's the low-hanging fruit, right? We and countries around the world, the Trafficking in Persons reports on 100, almost 200 countries. A lot of them have laws. We're at the point, I think, where we have to decide if we are serious about trafficking, if we're serious about ending slavery, or we're not. And if we are, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt consumers. We have to know we're going to pay more. We're going to pay more. That's what you have to do to give people a living wage to put the food on your table or whatever it is. Companies, it's going to hurt. It costs money to make your supply chain clean, and that's going to cut into your profits. True. Politicians, you might have to pass some laws that are unpopular with businesses or consumers or et cetera, because it's the right thing to do. And this is, I think, where we'll really be tested, and to see, are we abolitionists or are we apologists? And I'm not sure where we'll come out. I'd like to think we're abolitionists. But when I think about 20 years from now, though, I mean, personally, I think this is the moral and social issue of our time. The environment is as well. And our children are going to ask us, I mean, what I say to my students is this. I don't know about you, but when I look back at history, I think to myself, how is it that slavery existed? Like, how could you walk past a sale of human beings and ever think that was okay? Like, my mind cannot expand that far. And yet, when we remind ourselves that there are more people enslaved today than there were then, there's obviously more people in the world. When we think about online sales and defrauds of people, when we think about cases that come into the news, I wonder if 20 years from now, our children, grandchildren, depending on how old they are, will ask us, how is it that you let that happen? How is it that you, the United States, let that happen? How did you have the consumptive demand exception? How did you think it was okay to spend $2 on a t-shirt not knowing where it's from? Why did you not buy local? And I hope we have an answer for them.
Well, as a communicator by trade, I would also answer, rather than it being a cost that's going to hurt, it's an investment in reputation that a lot of these companies are going to make, right? So how much is your reputation worth to you? And, you know, that's you know, a different framing of it as well. So hopefully,
I think that's exactly right.
yeah, hopefully more of these businesses see that as the opportunity and as the important investment that it is, and being on the right side of history. I think we're all really how we do that today.
Sorry, it looks like everyone's getting an Amber Alert.
Oh goodness. Okay. Well, with that, I think we are going to close out our session. Professor Leary, thank you so very much for a really educational presentation, for all your super thoughtful answers and your resources that you've made available. Really appreciate you being here with us tonight, and bless you in your work. Please continue the good fight.
Thank you, and you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And for our audience, thank you so much for attending. As noted, you will get a link to the full recording when that is available. And please do take our survey when you receive it. We make these events better every time by getting feedback directly from you. So thank you.